And for the people who are, as I've said, awake to things, challenging the system, challenging our public servants, that in fact the system already in place, the Constitution, doesn't allow you to do the things that you're doing. And now if you had hundreds of thousands of people doing that and pointing that out to them every day, I would say it's game over. I don't think it's going to take vast numbers of what we would call unawake of society.
I'm delighted to announce that William will be joining us at Campout 2023, taking place between the 10th and the 13th of August as part of our Trailblazing Political Change panel on Sunday morning. It's going to be a fascinating discussion. So if you like what you hear during today's episode, then be sure to go over to campout.live, book your ticket for this year's event. Come and join us around the campfire for 4 days of talks, workshops, wellbeing activities, and more. Your chance to meet William and take part in the conversation about how we can trailblaze political change. Enjoy this episode.
William, tell us a little bit about who you are, your work, and why you're here at the Better Way conference.
Right. Well, firstly, because I was very kindly invited by Tess. That's the first reason, which I was quite surprised about. But I guess the main reason is that I think it was back in January that things went a little bit wild because I ended up on GB News with Neil and sort of blew the lid on a very hidden aspect of our constitutional law that even people in the establishment who are supposedly expert on these things really don't talk about, and they don't want to talk about it either, I suspect. And that is simply the mechanism that places the people in authority over their own government, which most people, if you ask them what that was, they would say, well, it's just about majority voting. And, that's the only influence that most people believe is the way that people would have influence over their government. And that isn't actually the case. That's not how it's supposed to operate. It's actually meant to be a much more direct mechanism. And that actually is a variety, if you like, of trial by jury, a form of trial by jury that we don't have in place today, that was meant to be in place under our constitutional law, that elevates the jury as the supreme legislature. So what that actually means is that they have the right to judge the government-created law. I use law in a loose term there. Legislation would be the right term to use. So they actually have the right to judge that at the same time. So they have a defendant before them in court, and the idea is that they're doing two things. They're actually judging the defendant, but they're kind of weighing that against the piece of legislation that's brought that defendant into court and saying, which one's the defective one? Is it the defendant's behaviour that's defective, or is it the piece of legislation? Now, what that does, of course, is it then places the people in authority over the legislature. And when you think of it like that, what you're actually doing at that point is placing the people in a position where they can define their own liberties. As the great American lawyer said, Lysander Spooner, in order to have an equitable society, you really have to place the people as the final arbiter of law, if you like. So that, I hope I've explained that okay there. So
yes, and I can certainly see the importance of such a conversation where a lot of the conference conversation has been about how that power, if you will, has been assimilated by centralized institutions at a global scale, often through public-private partnerships, superseded national state-level power. So it seems here at the Better Way conference, where we're looking for solutions and we're looking for practical ways to tackle these issues, that the piece of the puzzle that you bring is a way for us to look at how we reclaim that power. Now, I would like to unpack that a little more in a moment, but more broadly, within the context of this conference, why do you think the Better Way, this particular conference at this time in history, is so important?
Yeah, I mean, these kind of conferences, not that there are that many of these kinds of conferences, this is quite a special one, is all about bringing that positivity together. There's a sort of synergistic energy, if you like, of people who are thinking outside the box. And that's key because the majority of society are not really thinking outside the box. We're benefiting, if you like, from a broader knowledge. And when you get all of those people together in a space, a hell of a lot starts to happen, and you're starting to spark those ideas off each other. And it's been amazing. I mean, it's just a great energy that's been here. I was slightly embarrassed because I said to you earlier that I hadn't really been into any of the sessions yet. And that's because I've been spending such a lot of time talking to people on the end of queues. They've been catching me, and, and for me, in a way, that's really valuable, because that's about taking the temperature and seeing where people are with this kind of stuff. And I've been sipping tea and water outside the main entrance in the sun in Bath quite a lot, talking to people out there as well, having breaks and things. And it's just been amazing. I've had some really great conversations with people.
Well, I think those connections are so important. It's actually where a lot of the dots begin to connect and the ideas begin to unfold and percolate. I want to kind of come back to the solution part that you've articulated, which I think is such an important component. And the way, as I understand it, there's almost two ways to look at the solution. You've got the kind of practical element that you spoke about, which perhaps you could touch a little more on in the context of what we've just outlined. And then there's another component to that where we look at the alchemy, as you call it, of that. So could you unravel those two components for me?
Yes, I mean, it's not a quick one, this is not going to be a quick win. And the reason for that is largely because things are so out of kilter. With our governing system of this country is extremely wide of the mark. It's way out of alignment. And to a very great extent, it's actually us that's allowed that to happen. We need to be very careful, not just to think of that as a bunch of people behind the scenes kind of causing this. And, there's an element of that. Of course there is. But incrementally over time, we've allowed that to happen. We've outsourced huge portions of our lives, which has then distanced control from systems. We quite like the convenience of things. So when things become centrally controlled, that control point is actually much more distant away from us. And that's not the behavior of sovereign individuals that actually are meant to be self-masters, who are taking control and full responsibility of their lives. And that's a big problem. So you could argue that the condition that we have in society is largely a manifestation of our condition, consciously, internally, and our lack of addressing internal stuff. That's getting a little bit deeper. So where does that take us? I'm just thinking about your questions, because I'm going into all sorts of directions here. Before we come to that part, because I think that's an important component of it. But as you're speaking, I'm thinking how there's been that drift towards that. And I agree with you. I think it's very easy to point fingers at centralized powers. And that's part of what we've been doing, is analyzing where the power is held. Yes. Yeah. Without looking in the mirror to see how we've ceded that power. And if you look at, say, the political realm in the UK, less than 2% political party membership. Yeah. Irrespective of what you think about the political system, the parties, the reality is we're clearly 98+% of the population aren't able to influence parties if they're not participating. Quite right. So we have, in a way, relinquished our political power. And to me, politics, and I'd be curious to see your view on politics, but politics is part of life. It might sound boring, but actually we're all affected by it, and we're all, whether we think it or not, we're participating either by choice or we're at the effect. And I would say that the need for that political landscape has come about because of the sophistication of society and that centralization. Because in fact, politics is not really meant to be the thing that government is involved in. We shouldn't really be having government, that thing we think of as government, involved in anything at all. It's meant to be us governing through that jury process. But politics, as you call it, and I think of politics as party politics, indeed, largely. Yes. It is something quite recent. It only really emerged in the early to mid 1700s, in fact. And we think of party politics as democracy, right? Which it isn't, because the democratic mechanism, the primary mechanism of democracy, is actually the thing that I explained at the beginning, which is this mechanism of where you have a natural law tribunal deciding on justice within society every day, all over the country when cases come before it. That's the definition of democracy. That's really what democracy is. It's not really adult suffrage, which is what the political system is. So that's emerged much more recently. And it's not something that government should be involved in at all. The minutiae of our day-to-day lives, policy on our lives, really law is really only meant to be about moral behavior. That's it, nothing else. So what I suppose I'm saying is that in a pure society, when you're functioning under a proper constitution, under a common law constitution, you wouldn't really have a political sphere at all. Politics in that regard wouldn't be happening because life would be simpler. And it wouldn't be about you have to have a license for this, that, and the other. You can't drive into this city without paying this, that, and the other, or whatever it is. That just doesn't exist because it's not their area. They don't have the authority to deal with that kind of stuff. So, is that where you're kind of going with that?
Yeah. So I want to pick up a thread on that. So you're right. The kind of party politics that you've spoken about in the scheme of things, is recent.
Yes.
Now, in terms of the kind of more democratic system, constitutional system that you're referring to, is there a period within, specifically looking just at British history, is there a kind of golden period in the past where we've had a closer connection to the type of system that you're describing?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the law of the land, common law, legem terrae in Latin, was largely formed around the late Saxon times. So King Alfred certainly was famous for that. Edward the Confessor was absolutely key in putting that together, those customs. And that's what forms the central principles of our constitution. They're principles. It's not legislation or codified law. It's or legislation. It's a set of principles by which you are defining, what government can do, what it can't do, defining the rights of the people to have a trial by jury and convene it, and to decide on the justice of law. Those are the central principles of your constitution. And it predates Magna Carta of 1215, the Great Charter. So that sort of time, late Saxon kings going into the early Norman period, was probably a much purer form. That was when there was pushback. And then, of course, the formation of modern declaration of our constitution, which is the 1215 Magna Carta. That was for the powers that be, that was a pretty bad time. That was a bad moment for them, definitely.
Okay, now you mentioned how the kind of modern society that we live in, the complexity of the world that we live in now, an increasingly globalized world, has perhaps played a role in accelerating that path towards a more centralized, globalized system. Is the system you're referring to from those perhaps more golden period in history, would that now fit in that, under those conditions of complexity? Would it have to be modified to a degree, or
probably,
or would it? How would it harmonise with where?
Well, I think and it's really difficult to know.
Of course,
absolutely. I mean, there's no, and I think you're right. It's a really good question. I think would the pure form of our constitution actually work with a modern centralised society? No, definitely not. So what would have to change? Society would have to change. Simple as that. You either have your convenience, your modern conveniences, where you distance control and you lose that sovereignty, in which case you're going to have problems. You're always going to bring that cycle back on yourself. Or you simplify life. That doesn't mean to say it can't be connected. What it does mean is that it can't be centralised. And I think that's a key difference.
I think that's also one of the core tenets and themes of this weekend, whether by intention or not, is the decentralization.
Sovereignty.
Sovereignty.
Yeah.
Now, what's interesting, there's a paradox with the state of the world in which we live now, in that technology and all these advancements supposedly are supposed to make our life more simple and convenient, but the reality is we're facing greater complexity than ever before.
Yeah.
And I am curious about what you've just shared, and I wonder, taking the political dimension away from the fact that Britain has left Europe, does it create perhaps the fertile ground to readdress this question of constitution, because you're right, we don't have it codified, in contrast to, say, the United States. Is there an opportunity now to rethink, certainly in Britain, how we move forward with a constitution? Is this an opportunity now to bring some thinkers like yourself together and others to reimagine during this great transformative period, which we're discussing here at the conference, to actually explore a formalized constitution? Is that a path of possibility that you think is viable, or would it be
beneficial? I mean, I think just to clarify one or two things there. A constitution isn't codified. A constitution might be written. And contrary to what we're always told, our constitution is written as well. It's in the 1215 Magna Carta. It's included within it. Okay, so the chapters of the 1215 Magna Carta contain within it some of those chapters being what are called the Articles of Common Law. So you're looking at chapter 39, 40, 61, and there are one or two others too, which are the central principles of our Constitution as expressed within that document. So the idea of what they call a written Constitution doesn't quite mean in the plain English sense that it's written in a document. In their world, for a constitution to be written, it has to be like a dedicated single document, really clearly, which is much more like the American Constitution. So I tend to correct people and say, well, actually, it is written in the plain English sense. It is actually a written document. And they know that, actually. And if you remind various people like, David Starkey and Sumption and, I'm sure they know that, and you could get them to admit that, really. So it is a written constitution. There's no question about it. It's just not codified. Now, to answer your question about, there's a slight danger in saying, let's have a completely blank landscape and let's form a new constitution, if the large portion of the people have no idea what the central principles are, the central pillars of what you would need to support the society of liberty, of freedoms. And when people don't fundamentally know what are the central pillars of a democratic constitution, you've got a real danger there. Because if the system comes down and you have a vacuum again, I think we know what would happen then. That's quite a good position for the other side to come in and just, So either way, whatever happens, it's absolutely critical that large numbers of the population start to understand what it is that supports liberty and limits the power of government. That's why I'm starting to educate people.
That's the key. And I think that is the key. And you're right. The challenge here is that if the incumbent system were responsible for generating such a new constitution, then we would almost inevitably be baking in the problems of today.
Yes, they would legislate it.
Yes.
So one of the things that government is doing is pretending, and they're kind of getting away with it, which is what I call the cyclic argument of statute. The government consists of a law-making mechanism, which is Parliament. But their statutory powers to create legislation doesn't include a right to change the higher constitutional framework of law that they sit within. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
They can't write themselves into constitutional authority and remove those constraints that were placed on them. And that is one of the fundamental misunderstandings that a lot of people out there in the sort of awake community has. And it's a very fundamental misunderstanding in the establishment as well. I mean, right to the very top, there are people utterly confused within the establishment. And yet it's really quite a simple concept. I say to people, well, can the government do anything it likes legitimately? That's the key. Are you allowed as government to do what the hell you like lawfully and legitimately? And 30, 40 years ago, politicians would be a little bit coy about answering that question, but they would at least say, no, well, no, we can't do that, can we? No, of course we can't, Yes. Now they have a real problem in admitting that. And in fact, we know that because if you go on the Parliament website, it actually makes ridiculous claims like Parliament is sovereign. It's never been sovereign. It was never meant to be under the Constitution. They just don't understand.
See, William, this is why I asked the question about, is this an opportunity? Because it, to me, feels like when we look through some of the revolutionary periods in history, I would say some of the tenets of those periods are emerging.
Yes.
Some of the things we've talked about this weekend are the precursors to that type of certainly transformative thinking. You know, when we talk about revolutionary thinking, okay, it might seem radical.
Yeah.
Sometimes we need reform, but sometimes we need radical change. And I wonder, those misunderstandings that you refer to are certainly seem deliberate misunderstandings at times. So my question around formalizing a new constitution that will perhaps draw upon what's already written in those documents like the Magna Carta would help us to clarify those misunderstandings and reformalize that relationship between.
So my simple answer to that is I don't have an issue with forming a new constitution at a point when the people largely understand the central principles of what a democratic common law constitution must contain.
Yes,
so I mean, I would break it down.
Yes.
A democratic constitution breaks down to 3 principles. You've got to have a natural law tribunal,
Yes.
which is where the people can judge justice
Yes.
for themselves. Because in doing that, they're kind of defining their own liberties.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's the first thing and the most important. The second thing is that you would have some form of head of state who, if you were to replicate this in some tribe in the Amazon jungle or whatever it is a wise elder of the village who promises in perpetuity to keep that in place. And then the third thing is optionally, you could have a legislature, an existence of legislation, which is basically nothing more than a set of rules and regulations that all they do is bring people before judgment of their peers. They don't have the power to punish themselves. So if you break a statute, you don't automatically get a punishment. You just get brought before that judgment of your peers, of your social equals, who are then using their consciences to judge the morality behind what it is that you've done. Yeah. So that's it. Those are the 3 principles of the Constitution. Now, as long as you have that in place, and a lot of people in society understand that those are the principles, we could have a new constitution. Fantastic.
Yes, I mean, I jest a little, but that we could fit those principles on one page. But the question being, do we need nearly close to 70 million people to come into a room and say all in favor, say aye? How would we, because I appreciate and understand and support what you're saying around the people.
People need to understand it.
To understand it.
Yes.
But that feels like a long road.
It is, although I would say that, okay, so the awake community, and what do I mean by that? This is a community, it's a fairly low bar, but the community of those, at least within the country, who have recognized that something isn't right, that what they're told through mainstream channels of information is not really the truth. That's quite a big community now. That's a hell of a lot of people.
Indeed, I agree.
You know, you're into millions now, no question about it. So what you need is a tipping point. And is that community big enough if they were simply to unify and simply understand those constitutional principles? Yeah, I reckon. I reckon if what you might call the awake community or the freedom movement unified over this material, it would be game over. So how long would that take? Probably not very long, actually.
Well, that's also where it gets me thinking again, using that kind of reference to kind of revolutionary periods in time. It hasn't taken entire populations to bring about that change.
No, indeed.
If you look at the Declaration of Independence, it certainly didn't take the vast population of the United States, but it did take some courageous individuals, bright thinkers like yourself, no pressure, to come together and say, well, we're going to think differently about this, and we're going to entertain a path that's going to take us on this future direction that's going to alter the course of history.
Yeah.
And sure, there are processes that we could actually, referenda type processes that we could deploy to say, well, we're going to put it to the public vote. We're going to position this as a declaration of the British Constitution of the modern day, and there most surely must be a mechanism that would not require the full awareness, because there are challenges with that, but the full support. There are mechanisms that we can put in place to secure that. We've seen it, you know, the very fact that we have this situation where I refer to the post-Brexit Britain, where we have perhaps an opportunity to look at our constitution
Yeah.
There was a mechanism in place that enabled the public to participate in that. If several individuals came together to articulate what you've just profoundly put forward in its simplicity with supporting articles, is that...
There is an inherent danger in majority voting.
Of course.
Now, the reason for that, and that includes referenda, by the way.
Yes, indeed.
Because a referendum is repugnant to the Constitution.
Okay.
Sorry. and the reason for that is because people arrive at their opinion usually through a fairly superficial route, if you like. And the truth is often quite difficult to face. So you often find that it's the minority that take the trouble in finding that truth. Yeah. So majority voting is a massive problem.
I agree, particularly in the state of propaganda that we're delivered in right now, because the way you're informed, and even to make a vote, if you even do try to find a perspective, it's likely to be presented by the incumbent powers that are seeking to preserve that power.
Exactly.
I totally agree with your point.
Yeah, and consensus is very dangerous.
I would have very much of a concern about that, which again comes back to then what is the mechanism by which that change could occur? Because whilst I do agree it may be a misunderstanding with the historical reference, bringing that into the present day with a new renaissance, with a new formality that would help us to bring it into a new era.
Yeah.
What is the solution then? If we struggle to raise awareness to the 70 million-ish people on the planet on the Isles of Britain, then referenda is not adequate. How then do we?
Education. It's nothing more than education. It absolutely has to be nothing more than spreading the word. And for the people who are, as I've said, awake to things, challenging the system, challenging our public servants, that in fact the system already in place, the Constitution, doesn't allow you to do the things that you're doing. And now if you had hundreds of thousands of people doing that and pointing that out to them every day, I would say it's game over. I don't think it's going to take vast numbers of what we would call unawake of society. I mean, in the process of doing that, you're going to awaken a hell of a lot more people. But what I'm really after is a national conversation.
Yes.
This is really about a shaming exercise, about inconvenient truths and bringing that to the surface. I know that sounds a little bit nebulous, but ultimately what you're after is an awakening, a further, deeper awakening of people, of self-reflection and beginning to realize that we got to take responsibility for this. This is about sovereignty. I just don't think that there's anything else that is going to nail this other than an education process and people self-reflecting.
Thank you, William. This has been a profound conversation, certainly a conversation starter about how we can begin to actually reclaim our power, reclaim our sovereignty, to adhere to the Constitution that does exist, and how we can bring that into the modern age. Thank you so much. This has been fascinating.
Thanks, Dan.
Thank you so much for tuning in to my conversation with William Keyte, recorded at the Better Way conference. As you can see from the interview, this was a subject that I really wanted to get my teeth into. We only had a limited amount of time to discuss this particular subject, but it's one that really does truly fascinate me. And I'm delighted, as I mentioned at the beginning of today's episode, that William will be joining us at this year's Campout, where we'll have an opportunity to explore these ideas further and spend some more time together with William. So if you'd like to meet William, to be part of the conversation about how we can create political change, how we can create sovereignty, then head over to campout.live. The event is coming up really, really fast now. So be sure to book your ticket today to secure your place. And I hope to see you around the campfire for an amazing 4 days of talks, workshops, music, discussions, great food, time in nature, and more. See you at Campout 2023. Go to campout.live to join us.